that's another, it's truly almost a hack that I want to tell you about to learn Portuguese that it seems like no one is doing. Hey, aí galera, tudo bem? What's up guys? My name's Gavin, I'm from the US, and since 2012 I've taught myself Brazilian Portuguese, and I want to talk with you guys today about some hacks, some resources, some things that work, some things that maybe don't work to help you master this amazingly beautiful and useful language. Now this video is a little different from videos I typically do on this channel because I'm speaking in English. Since 2012 when I started Portuguese, I started this YouTube channel and I now have over 1 million followers in Brazil. It's so cool to be able to use Portuguese every day. It's crazy because back in 2012 when I started learning Portuguese, I was a grad student and I was just kind of bored with what I was doing. In my free time, I wanted to learn another language and I kind of randomly chose Portuguese because it's the 5th most spoken language in the world, and I thought, hey, maybe I'll go to the World Cup in 2014, or maybe I'll meet a Brazilian someday. Who knows? Portuguese could be useful. In 2012, I bought 2 textbooks which ended up being amazing for starting out with a good foundation in Portuguese. They were Poisonal and Modern Brazilian Portuguese Grammar. By the way, I'll put all the links for these resources in the description below. The awesome thing about this textbook is if you have some foundation in Spanish, you do not have to start from zero. This textbook is specifically for native speakers of English who know some Spanish enough and who want to learn Portuguese. Most of the conjugations are the same. 60 to 70% of the vocabulary is the same, but it's that 30 to 40% that's not that will kill you. So awesome resource. And another awesome resource for those of you who haven't learned Spanish, and for those of you who have too, is this Modern Brazilian Portuguese Grammar. I've heard this textbook described as the Bible of modern grammar in Brazil, and it's so true. I've highlighted so many passages throughout here. The great thing about this book is that, for example, the chapter on demonstratives I just turned to. It's a fancy way of saying how to use this or that in Portuguese. Sure, it gives you your table of your translations, but it gives you actual sentences that you can imagine yourself using in Brazil. And over breakfast, over scrambled eggs, I just picture myself saying, "Você está vendo aquela casa verde?" Or another way to learn aquela. Acordei com aquela ressaca hoje. I still review this book to this day, and it's super important to me. And of course, I bought a dictionary too. It was helpful, but there's a lot more awesome dictionaries online now that I'll tell you about in a minute. Now, back in those days in 2012, I also kept a little journal of Portuguese. There's some amazing resources online, especially on YouTube, and the first YouTube video I ever watched to learn Portuguese was this one right here. It was through this video that I started to learn pronunciation in Portuguese. For example, the nasal vowel, which doesn't exist in Spanish or in English. No. This little tilde. No. I still have trouble with this sound sometimes. Back in 2012 also, I kept physical flashcards. Like I would see that, okay, colher means spoon. I would quiz myself on them like once a month probably. Nowadays, there's way better apps for that, and I'm not talking about Duolingo. We'll get to those apps in a second. My advice to you is to get your pronunciation right from the very beginning. Put emphasis on pronunciation and word order more than specific complicated grammar or verb conjugations. Pronunciation, word order. Trust me. Confia em mim. I mean, if you want to. Let's fast forward to 2013 when my wife and I decided we're gonna make this dream into a reality and we're gonna book tickets for the World Cup in Brazil in 2014. It was the excitement for this trip that kept me motivated when sometimes textbooks can only be so motivating. So book yourself a trip. The plane ticket's expensive, the visa's a little expensive, and Brazil's not as cheap as some Americans think, but it is so worth it in ways that I can't even begin to describe to you. And so for now, we're just gonna stick to Portuguese. So anyway, 2013, I was still a grad student and I was still biking in about 30 minutes every day to work. And instead of listening to music or comedy podcasts, I started to listen to Brazilian Portuguese podcasts specifically for learners. And here's the very iPod on which I did it. throw the earbuds in, get in the concentration mode. The first thing I did on a friend's suggestion was check out from the library the whole Pimsleur series of Brazilian Portuguese lessons. These go from beginner to advanced. Essentially what you're hearing is an explanation of the grammar in English and then a situation like, could you please pass me that pen? They would teach you how to say that, and then you would have to imagine that you were in the same situation, perhaps in a business office, and you had to ask for the pen now. Or someone asked from the pen from you, and the podcast paused to allow you time to think of the response and answer. Pode passar a caneta, por favor? It probably seemed like an idiot, a crazy man on my bike. But it was through these that I started really to think about how I would converse in actual situations instead of just freezing up like it's so easy to do for beginner language learners. Pimsleur was good. I wouldn't say they were great. They were very focused on business Portuguese. And what I needed was something that could get by in the stadiums in Brazil, on the beach. Another amazing podcast that I listened to is called Tá Falado. It's out of the University of Texas. Tá falado literally means it is spoken. And this podcast is for people who have no language learning experience or people who have already learned Spanish too, just like the textbook Pois Não. This podcast gave dialogues in restaurants in Brazil or on the beach or playing a soccer game in the US with Brazilians. And the awesome thing is they give the dialogue in English with a native speaker of American English. Then they repeat it twice in Portuguese with 2 different accents. And then they repeat it in Spanish so you can hear how the Portuguese sounds juxtaposed with the Spanish. And by the way, yes, 2 different accents of Brazilian Portuguese. You would not believe how many accents of Brazilian Portuguese there are within Brazil. We think that in the US, oh, you have your New York accent, you have your Boston accent, you have your Southern accent. Let's be real, when you're on a plane with someone, usually you can't tell if they're from Florida or Washington or Maine or California, all 4 corners of the contiguous US. In Brazilian Portuguese, I would say there are 10 times more regional variations. And this is not something to be scared about. This is a good thing. Well, why is that a good thing? Because when you have an accent, which you inevitably will as a native English speaker, if you start to get at the moderate level of Portuguese, people won't necessarily recognize you're a foreigner. They might instead guess that you're just from a different part of Brazil. That would never happen in the US. I mean, after 3 or 4 words, you can tell that the person's not from the US. Super cool, but anyway, I digress. I'd say by the time that I was starting to listen to these podcasts, I was still, reading the textbooks every once in a while, keeping my notebook. By now, it was about 40 minutes a day that I was teaching myself Portuguese. But again, it was because of this awesome trip I had planned that I was doing it. Find that motivation for yourself. Find it. The 40 minutes becomes a true pleasure at that point, and you will have to work. It's not magic that you learn a foreign language, but oh my God, is it worth it. It was around the end of 2013 that I started to expose myself to more of the culture of Brazil too. And how do you do this from remote? Well, I checked out some of the most famous movies, music, and books out of Brazil. The first movie I ever watched was Orfeu Negro, Black Orpheus, from the 1950s, I think. It was black and white. When you're watching movies, don't use subtitles either. I didn't understand probably half of the movie or what was happening, but you learn so much more without subtitles. Again, please trust me on this one and go out of your comfort zone. No subtitles. And by the way, if you're a Brazilian still watching this, maybe list some good movies or music or books down in the comments for learners of Portuguese to check out. Some music that I remember listening to also on my bike rides, the Tribalistas. Oh my gosh, you have to check out the Tribalistas. Really clear Portuguese in their melodies. It's a trio, 2 men and a woman. Dois homens e uma mulher. But yeah, the crispness of their singing really helped me. Gilberto Gil, amazing guitarist.
Começou a circular o expresso 2222.
And the band of the 80s in Brazil, Legião Urbana. I actually even taught myself how to play this song by them on guitar to help me with my Portuguese. And when you're memorizing lyrics,
Eu tinha medo tão João de Santo Cristo, era o que todos diziam quando ele se perdeu.
You learn so much. I learned songs by three ballistas too. I'm only an okay guitar player, but I don't know, something about that crossover between music and language, if you can somehow figure out a way to even just sing along to songs or translate song lyrics on lyricstranslate.com, I found that immensely beneficial too. And some books I'll recommend, of course, because I love reading. Bookworm. Jorge Amado is incredible. He's a writer out of the northeast of Brazil. The first two books I read by him were actually in English. I just wanted to familiarize myself with the culture. But he writes pretty simply. This one that I read was the first one I read in Portuguese, A Morte e a Morte de Quincas Berro d'Água. And they all talk about poor Brazilians, often children, growing up and having to live a marginalized existence and get by. Oh, another awesome thing that I did, I almost forgot about this. Back in 2011, before I started learning Portuguese, I had read The Alchemist. Most of you have probably heard of The Alchemist. Super popular book, very motivational, great story, and you know what? It's by another Brazilian author that I recommend, Paulo Coelho, and here's the original version that I ended up buying in Portuguese, O Alquimista. But it was amazing to be able to have these books side by side, and I would try as hard as I could to read the Portuguese, and when I didn't know a Portuguese word, I'd have the English book opened up next to me and I could just see how it was translated. This is so much better than using a dictionary. Do not use a dictionary when you're reading, okay? To see whole sentences and how their context is translated is so much more important. If you don't have an English language copy, then just guess with the context. Just like subtitles in a movie, do not use them. Do not use a dictionary either when you're reading. But again, it's great to read something that you've already read in your native tongue before, because you're familiarized with the story and you can work on trying to understand the Portuguese this time instead. 2014 hits, the year of the World Cup. The final step for me before going to Brazil to watch some soccer games, futebol. It sounds weird to say soccer now that I know futebol. The last puzzle piece was to get a conversation partner on the internet. Now the two sites I'm going to recommend to you for this are italki and YouTube, actually. And what does having a conversation partner entail? Well, typically you can either pay for lessons, and italki is fantastic for this. italki.com, I'll put it in the description. And that means you'll have an hour straight of Portuguese conversation or lessons with a tutor or someone who's used to presenting the Portuguese language to beginners. Or you can try to test your luck and find a conversation partner with whom you'll typically have Skype calls of half an hour in English, half an hour in Portuguese. I've tried both and they're fantastic for their own separate reasons. And I mentioned that YouTube is a good resource because, hey, if you're a Brazilian watching this video and you want a conversation partner, just write a comment below. And if you're someone wanting to learn Portuguese, believe me, for every one person wanting to learn Portuguese, there's 100 people wanting to learn English who are native Portuguese speakers. So you will not have a problem finding a conversation partner if you scroll in the comments below this video. Just leave comments here, in this video here. Leave some comments. Get those conversation partners. But oh my gosh, I was so nervous before my first Portuguese conversation with this guy from São Paulo, and he ended up becoming one of my best friends. You have embarrassing moments with each other, you make so many mistakes that you correct for each other, but you end up with this rich, non-textbook Portuguese. For example, I got in the habit of writing in my dictionary in the very front some of the things that my language partner, Dogi, would teach me. Like one funny story is that in English, we often say during conversations with the other person, interesting. So I started saying during our conversations, oh, interessante, which I had learned as the actual translation of interesting. But they don't say that in Portuguese. They're these cultural conventions that we don't realize are different in the other language. And so Doug taught me 4 or 5 different things to say instead of interessante. Caramba, beleza, legal, caraca, da hora, mano. The last one's super São Paulo slang. So many great things that I would not have learned in textbooks. Now, textbooks are still great for the conjugations and the grammar base, but man, to be able to use opa well, or to understand what someone's saying to you when they say tendeu during their entire conversation, get a conversation partner, or get a language tutor on Skype through italki. I cannot begin to tell you how worth it is. The day of the World Cup, I bought my very first soccer jersey from Brazil, and now I have like 20. This is the jersey I bought from Esporte Clube Bahia in the Northeast. And it's orange because that day we were watching Spain versus the Netherlands, and I wanted to support the Netherlands. The Netherlands ended up winning 5-1, and guys, being in Brazil, in the atmosphere of the World Cup was just such an amazing experience, and I used my my Portuguese all the time. I was with my wife and a group of 6 other friends. I was the only one who spoke Portuguese, and in Brazil, only about 10% of people speak English. You will have to learn Portuguese to travel well in Brazil. And all those minutes over breakfast reading my textbook, all those rides into grad school listening to podcasts, looking like an idiot, repeating phrases out loud, people looking at me. It was all worth it to be in Brazil, and I fell in love with the culture even more than I ever could have expected. Book that trip to Brazil. Make it be your motivation to learn Portuguese, this amazing language. But don't wear soccer jerseys in public because the rivalries are insane. It's not like wearing a Cleveland Indians jersey here in the US. I'll probably get comments on this video, Bora Bahia! But I'll get a lot of people who hate Bahia too. So I've decided to remain neutral, but this shirt is very special to me. Best day of my life. Maracanã, 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 Maracanã. Nasal vowels. Get excited. But okay, 2015, so motivated to continue with Portuguese. I thought I'd be done with the World Cup and it'd be over. No, it just makes you want to learn more. But, okay, I could express simple things and I would listen for words and conversations, but I still didn't have that quick reaction thing down, so I wanted to continue with the conversation partner, and I needed to grow my vocabulary. Specifically, verbs. Guys, they say verbs are the spice of language, and it's so true. If you increase your nouns by 10 times, you'll just be able to point at more things and say what they are. But if you increase the amount of verbs you know by 10 times, you will sound natural, native, almost eloquent and poetic, and you will be complimented on it. But how do you learn 10 times more verbs? A Brazilian friend of mine recommended the app Anki. Now in 2015, I had just gotten a smartphone, and it was so worth it to get this free flashcard app, Anki. Don't do Duolingo. Duolingo's okay if you're a kid wanting to get the basics, but if you really want to remember words and phrases and flashcards, to be able to use them in real life situations, to be able to pull them so quickly out of your head, you need to use one of these 3 apps that have what's called time-spaced repetition. And since I'm talking about geeky tech things again, I guess I'll wear my bicycle helmet. But the applications Anki, Memrise, and Quizlet are all flashcard applications that have existing decks in Portuguese, even decks focusing on verbs. And when I say time-spaced repetition, I mean that I will study a flashcard, and if I know what's on the back, then I won't see the flashcard for 4 days. And if I study it again in 4 days and I know it, I won't see it again come up until 3 weeks, and then a year, and then etc., etc. It sorts the flashcards for you based on how well you remember them. If I don't know a verb that I'm trying to study, I'll see it again the next day. And if I don't know it then, I might see it again in an hour. These time-spaced repetition are actually, a lot of them are called SRS, spaced repetition systems. They're so amazing for memorizing a vast amount of vocabulary. And again, this is vocabulary that if you know it quick enough, that means that in real life, you're also able to pull this random term from your passive vocabulary into your active vocabulary, meaning what's coming out of your mouth. They're all free in their base versions, and it was after just, I don't know, 4 or 5 months of studying flashcards on Anki in 2015 that I truly felt that I had crested the hill towards fluency. The hard part was over, and now it was the fun stuff. And it was the fun stuff. It was in 2015 that I posted my first video on YouTube. I literally just started the camera and just started talking for 5 minutes.
Cultura foi melhor do que eu que achei. E a comida do Salvador, acarajé.
That video sat for 3 or 4 months without being noticed, and all of a sudden Brazilians started trickling in and saying, hey, good Portuguese, you sound almost like a native, or hey, you could improve this certain thing, but really good job. Brazilians are the friendliest, most encouraging, helpful people on the planet. You'll discover this on YouTube or with conversation partners. But that's another, it's truly almost a hack that I want to tell you about to learn Portuguese that it seems like no one is doing. Record yourself. Record yourself talking, watch it, and edit it. You'll see how many mistakes you make. Because it's easy for us to notice other people making mistakes, but it's hard to notice yourself making mistakes. I noticed bad habits of mine, poor pronunciations, and a lot of times people watching my videos on my growing YouTube channel would point out my many mistakes. But the best thing about this whole thing, you never make that mistake again because you've watched yourself and recognized it and tried to edit it to edit out that mistake, but you couldn't, so you still have to post it on YouTube. Don't watch YouTube, create for YouTube. That is ultimately how you will become fluent and interact and weave yourself in with this amazing, amazing culture of Brazilians, this amazing community online of language learners. In Portuguese, they say "tamo junto," which means like we're in this together, and we really are all in this together, and don't forget it, and don't be embarrassed when you make mistakes. It's so part of the process, and just, if you're not making 200 mistakes a day, you're doing something wrong. Just love it and enjoy it. And finally, challenge yourself. Always get out of your comfort zone. I don't know, could I call this a hack? I guess so. You know, it's easy to say challenge yourself, but I mean it. I started listening to this podcast now in 2016 called Nerdcast. It's like, I don't know, the popular science podcast of Brazil, biking to work, of course. And at the beginning, I understood maybe 40% of what they're saying, and it's a lot of jokes and quick interactions, talking as quick as I'm talking right now. Oh my God. But that's how you learn the jeito. That's how you learn the way, and it's a challenge, but it's so worth it. Try hard books, guys. Get away from the apps, get away from the computer screens and technology, and try just reading. Challenge your mind too. This is like the Shakespeare of Portuguese, Machado de Assis. To this day, I understand maybe 60% of it, I would say. And don't use a dictionary. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. It ruins the fun of reading. It sucks all the life out of it. Just try to learn by context. And if you absolutely have to use a dictionary, use lingui.com, where you can see the word translated but used in actual sentences, in actual phrases, and not just a sterile word by itself in the dictionary that's going to have way less of the meaning that's important for you to remember, that's easy for you to remember. Clarice Lispector. Oh my gosh, how could I forget this? This is azeite de dendê, palm oil. It's almost impossible to find here in the US, and I picked it up on my last trip to Brazil because another thing I decided to do to get out of my comfort zone was to try to start cooking in the Brazilian style. My wife got me these 2 cookbooks, and we've tried to recreate lots and lots of recipes for moqueca, pão de queijo, brigadeiro. Do these outside the box interesting things. Don't just always be doing the same thing, and make the time for yourself. Set aside 30 minutes a day at least if you're truly serious about revving up your Portuguese. Set aside those 30 minutes and study. Study flashcards, read, listen to podcasts, do what it takes. I wish you so much sorte, boa sorte na jornada along your journey of learning Portuguese. Leave a comment if you're looking for a conversation partner in Portuguese, or for you Brazilians, if you're looking for a conversation partner in English. And let me know if you're learning Portuguese too. What other resources have you used that have helped you along your way? Because everyone's story is different, and it's always fascinating to talk about this subject. So with that, I will bid you a farewell and book those tickets to Brazil. Dang it!